Hi, Jenni here, and during the month of September I read two major classics, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Woo! In this video I will discuss reading both of those classics and my opinion on them and my analysis of them. Obviously, this video will contain some spoilers, so if you still haven't read those books and don't want to be spoiled, maybe skip this one. I'm gonna start with Wuthering Heights since I finished it first, and obviously I did start both of these books at the end of August, but I read most of them in September. So yes, first off, Wuthering Heights. I do want to be superficial for a moment and discuss how stunning this edition is. I think they're by Collector's Library, but when I've Googled Collector's Library, I can't find these specific editions anymore. This is a very compact edition, but still very readable, beautiful golden pages, and yeah, props on the physical copy of the book. This has been on my shelf, waiting to be read for 11 years. Listen, I don't know why it took me this long. I bought this when I was 17, and in a way I'm glad that it took me this long, because I feel like back then when I bought this and years before this one, I didn't have the intellectual maturity for this one, if that makes sense. I first started off reading just the first two chapters, seeing like, okay, let's see how this goes, maybe I'll read it, let's see. And I ended up being intrigued by it, so I finished it. I read this quite slowly at times, maybe like 1 to 2 chapters a day, but then there were times when the story itself was so intriguing and captivating that I would read multiple chapters. So this is obviously about one Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw. They meet when Heathcliff is adopted by Catherine's father. He is an orphan, and it has been widely analyzed that Heathcliff is a person of color, a racialized person. So they grow up together and they really like each other, and it turns into love. But Catherine knows that due to Heathcliff's background, she cannot marry him, and she ends up marrying Linton. I don't remember his first name. First name irrelevant. And this causes very strong emotions and very strong-willed thirst for revenge on everyone that has wronged Heathcliff and Catherine. At first, I had issues, or I found it challenging to follow the narration. In a way, I expected it to be from Heathcliff's or Catherine's perspective, but it was actually one of the tenants in one of Heathcliff's houses, if I remember correctly. And then the housekeeper who lived with the Earnshaws and with Catherine and Heathcliff all these years, that tells the tenant the whole story of what has happened at Wuthering Heights. At first, I found that challenging, but when I kind of read more specifically and focused on like, okay, who is saying what's right now, I got it. It made more sense to me. It's been a few weeks now since I've finished this book, and I think the first thing that comes to mind from my reading experience is that everyone is very angry. And I think the author depicts this anger in a very lively way that I could feel the intensity of the feelings of these characters, especially Heathcliff and Catherine as well. I would not call this a romance like other people say. Yes, it is about love, because I do think that Heathcliff and Catherine have this deep love that other people do not understand, but I wouldn't call it romantic in that sense, because it's also very possessive, it's very intense, and while they do have this deep understanding of each other, it's very tumultuous. I was very surprised that Catherine dies by like the half of the book. I was very confused at what would happen next since Catherine has passed. The story continues with the next generation of these families, with Catherine's daughter Catherine, and then Heathcliff's son, and then Catherine's brother's son Hareton. The tumultuous relationships continue, and I understand where the anger is coming from each character. For Heathcliff, you know, he is treated horribly by Catherine's brother once Mr. Earnshaw, the father of the family, dies. He is treated absolutely horribly. Catherine obviously not being able to marry and be with the man he loves and like kind of feeling overlooked as a woman. Like I can see the motivations for the anger for each character very clearly, which shows that the author has explained the motivations of each character really clearly. I think the idea of loneliness and isolation is very delicately and like specifically explained, because we see the isolation of Heathcliff from society, and also his anger causes people to isolate from him, but it was the treatment of people who treated Heathcliff horribly that causes him to isolate from other people, and the passing of Catherine causes Heathcliff to be even more lonely and just focusing on revenge for Catherine. I think the book is a really great psychological study of what happens when you experience racism, classism, and your wishes are not respected. I don't think, again, it's a romance. I think of it more as like a thriller. Well, not really, that's a joke. Overall, I was really happy that I read this book, and I liked the ending where everything had calmed down and the thirst for revenge ultimately faded away. And I think the idea of Heathcliff being joined with Catherine in death and Heathcliff finding solace in that was very interesting, and in a way a great culmination of this tumultuous relationship and events that happened after. So while I don't view this as romantic, I don't view this as a romance love story that should be admired, I thought this was a really interesting book, and I'm really happy that I read it. I think Nellie worked really well as the narrator because a lot of characters trusted her, and she could tell this story forward. At moments I was like, how can Nellie remember everything so specifically? It was incredible. I didn't really talk about Isabella, but I think hers was a bit of an unfortunate story, like her finding Heathcliff interesting and attractive, and then Heathcliff just uses her to get back to the Lintons. Then they have a child, and yeah, I think Emily Bronte discusses those aspects of womanhood when you are just being used as a tool really delicately. And at times I felt pretty stunned by the story, which shows that Emily Bronte was really capable of writing emotive text. I don't know if I would specifically recommend Wuthering Heights. I feel like it's such a well-read book at this moment that my recommendations don't really matter. But if you are interested in reading about how class and race and wealth impact characters and their personal lives, definitely interesting. I can see why this is a notable English classic. And I know what you're thinking, the trailer to the adaptation. Listen, I can see that there are very strong artistic freedoms that the director took with this story. And the theory of Margot Robbie not being actually Catherine, but rather a woman who tries to embody Catherine is interesting. I'm not completely sold on the adaptation, especially with Jacob Elordi assumingly playing Heathcliff, who is a racialized character, and Jacob Elordi is white. But I am expecting to see like a second trailer to make my decision if I want to see the movie. I'm not completely rejecting this adaptation, but I am hesitant of it. And then next up is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, translated from Spanish into English by Gregory Rabassa. I read this in English as well. I do have the Finnish translation there, but I read this book with my friend Aure, and as I started reading the book, I felt like both of us reading the English translation just worked better. And I do want to start off with the disclaimer that I am from Finland, I am white, I am from the Western Hemisphere. So there must be some aspects to 100 Years of Solitude that I just do not have the full understanding of the experience and the culture behind the book. I did do a lot of research and reading of Colombia and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the context of the book, but I understand that my geographical location and the culture that I lived in might impact my reading experience of this book. And if I've completely misunderstood something, please correct me in the comments. So like I mentioned, I read this book with my friend Aure. We read Middlemarch by George Eliot in the beginning of the year, and I really enjoyed reading a book with a friend. So I then suggested that we read this mammoth of a classic together as well. And obviously 100 Years of Solitude is based on the fictional town of Macondo, which is like based on Colombia. A lot of it is also based on Garcia Marquez's own hometown. The main characters are, in the beginning, Jose Arcadio Buendia and Ursula Buendia, who are cousins and get married. They establish the town of Macondo, and the whole book is about following their descendants as they live in Macondo and as the town flourishes and develops. But ultimately, as wars rage on and as foreign interests come into town, the town meets its decline that was in a way predicted all along. That's a very, very vague summary of the book. I feel like Aure said it best. I've never read anything like this book. I'll start with kind of the writing style and kind of analysis of it all before I share my opinion. I thought the writing was incredibly clever and again like something I've never experienced before. The narration is chronicle but also non-linear, that we jump into events here and there while also following the chronological order of things. The narrator seems to be omniscient. It's almost like the narrator is a character within the book that is like a version of Garcia Marquez himself. I think I read somewhere that some people understood that Melquiades would be the narrator, but he's also a character in the book, and yeah, it's just brilliantly mastered. As I learned more and more about the historical context of some of the events, I was kind of amazed how Garcia Marquez articulated them. For example, when the banana company comes into Macondo, that was something that reflected on real life. Those were the parts of the book that I really, really enjoyed and I thought were really well made. And I think some of it is still relevant to this day, especially like the massacre of all those employees, 3,000 of them, and how it was pushed under the rug and it was said that that never happened, that Macondo has always been this happy, peaceful place when it has a very tumultuous history. It was really interesting to see the cycle of these events and decisions characters made repeated generation after generation. And I could really see that Garcia Marquez was trying to show that even though other generations, younger generations, tried to change, tried to be better than previous ones, they always ended up in the same place. Especially at the end with Amaranta Ursula, who ended up studying Brussels and really wanting to make a life for herself, but then she ends up in the same place as the women before her. I couldn't really connect to many characters, and I think that was part of it because they are repetitions of characters before, if that makes sense. And I think some of the events in the book and plot devices I thought we could do without. I thought I can see what's the point of this, but I don't think it was necessary that the same message could have been delivered without this. I think if you read 100 Years of Solitude, maybe you know what I mean, but I'll try to put this into terms that YouTube then doesn't completely suppress my video. I understand why violence against women was repeated there often and how female characters were mistreated quite often and they were represented that they don't really have their own agenda a lot of times and they were not to be taken seriously. I can understand that, but at times it felt like there was nothing more to these female characters than just being there to serve the male characters. Again, commentary on society, probably, most likely, but there was a lot of it, and especially violence against women. Some of the scenes in the book were absolutely horrifying. It's a fine line between doing commentary on society through having these violent scenes and then just having SA just because you can add it, if that makes sense. Also, I understood the overarching theme of familial romantic relationships. Let's put it that way. But that felt a bit too intense too. I understand the ending, definitely, even if characters were trying to become their own people and maybe get away from the family curse in quotes. But oh my god, there was a lot of familial romantic relationships, or like developments of it. And some of them were fulfilled, some were not. I wish Remedios had more to her than just being a victim of grooming. Let's just put it that way. I really hope YouTube doesn't censor my video. Yeah, a lot of it, like, I understood where Gabriel Garcia Marquez was coming from, but I did feel a lot of it was also a bit unnecessary. It is hard. It is absolutely difficult for me to say, like, ultimately what was my opinion of the book, because there is no other book like it. I've never read anything like this before. Yes, I love familial historical fiction of going through different generations within a book. I love that, but none of the books that I've read before can be compared to this one. I am glad to have read it, and I can see the value of it, and there were some aspects in the book that I was like, I get it, I get why this is so important as a classic and in literature. But then there were those some aspects that I thought were unnecessary and at times didn't serve the story well. And I know there must be people who disagree with me, and I get that, and I'm not gonna apologize for my opinion. Again, maybe it's my Western perspective on the book, but I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. But yeah, written incredibly, very imaginative, very specific, a great reflection on society, and some people have compared this book to the Bible, and I kind of get it. Okay, so I think what was really interesting about reading these two books at the same time was the common theme of society and isolation and solitude. Obviously very differently represented. More so in Wuthering Heights, when society stops people from one being treated like they should be treated, and society and racism keeping people in their place to maintain the status quo. And then solitude in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, where family is separated from each other. Like, for example, Aureliano Buendia goes on to all of these battles, and so many other characters distance themselves from the character and then come back, and then they view the family differently. The family being ostracized from other society and completely being forgotten about at the end of the book. Like, interesting similarities there. And finally, on 100 Years of Solitude, I think the distortion of history and hiding the truth from people, especially at the end of the book, was incredibly well done, and again reflected on many atrocities that has happened in the world. And for that, I do think that Gabriel Garcia Marquez deserves all of the accolades that he has received. But ultimately, I am glad that I read this book, but it wasn't really for me. Some aspects of it I found deeply engaging and interesting, but then some of the stuff I found unnecessary and demeaning towards female characters. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not me saying that you cannot talk about, SA grooming, familial, romantic relationships. That's not what I'm saying. I just found it hard to see in some moments how they serve the story, if that makes sense. September was a month of intense reading. I am really happy to have read these classics. I feel like I gained a lot from these reading experiences, and I can see why they are classics. Have you read these books? What did you think of them? If you want to see more reading updates from me, follow me on my bookstagram, jenskosmos. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Bye!